I always thought I would stay at Frostline Logistics for the long haul. When you live in Austin, where everything revolves around tech and new operating models, you feel like you are standing right in the middle of the future. This city has a kind of energy that convinces you hard work will eventually be seen. I believe that for 11 years. I am Aria Moreno, 34, a predictive intelligence engineer specializing in cold chain coordination. It sounds glamorous, but most days it is just 3 monitors watching temperature data stream across the screen 24 hours a day. I am not the talkative type. My coworkers joke that the loudest sound I make is my keyboard. They are not wrong. But silence does not mean invisibility. I built the ColdSense predictive engine, a risk forecasting model I coded entirely on my own laptop during long weekends. I wrote the simulations, kept every development log, and Frostline rolled it out across the entire supply chain. They used it to market themselves, to close big contracts, to prove they were ahead in the industry. They just never said my name, never acknowledged who created it. I told myself I could live with that it was simply part of the job. But the reason I walked into the chief executive officer's office that morning was not recognition. It was pay. I had been underpaid for too long, and after 11 years, I knew what my work was worth. I asked for a 15% raise. Not outrageous, just aligned with market value. Victor Hale, the new chief executive officer, worked on the 20th floor in an office wrapped in glass and polished dark wood, sunlight pouring in like a spotlight. He came from finance, not engineering, and was known for a confidence that bordered on condescension. People said he liked control and liked you to know he had it. When I presented my request, Victor leaned back, studied me for a few seconds, then laughed. Not a polite laugh, but a long and loud one, the kind that freezes you in place. He said the company could not justify that raise, that my work did not translate into direct business value, that Frostline could hire another engineer and the system would run just fine. I stood there and listened, feeling myself shrink inch by inch. When he finished laughing, he added that I was just support, that the budget needed to go to roles that truly drive revenue. He said it casually, like explaining something obvious. Lydia Trent, my department head, stood by the whiteboard holding a stack of reports. She had been taking credit for my work for years. When Victor laughed, she smiled too. The quiet, satisfied smile of someone who always wants you one step lower. I gathered my proposal, suddenly heavier than paper should ever feel. Victor turned back to his screen as if the entire conversation had never happened. I stepped into the hallway, the burst of overcooled air conditioning hitting my face, a reminder that Frostline was always colder than necessary. I walked past the glass wall overlooking Austin. The city was still bright, alive, full of opportunity. And there I was, someone who stayed for more than a decade, believing loyalty would matter. Back at my desk, the keyboard waited. The monitors streamed their endless cold chain data, and my half-finished coffee had gone lukewarm. I looked at all of it and felt a hollow space open up inside me. Like a small door had swung open, and the wind rushed straight through. For the first time, I was not sure I belonged there anymore. And if you are listening to me now, I want to know where you are. Leave a comment and tell me which corner of America or which faraway place you are hearing this from. Stories about reclaiming your worth travel farther than we think. If you are with me on this journey, stay close, because everything truly begins the moment I walk out of Frostline's doors. When I returned to my desk, the emptiness was still pressed against my chest, like a cold that refused to melt. I reopened the ColdSense monitoring system and tried to work as usual, but I could not focus. In recent months, the once busy Frostline office had started to look like a temporary storage warehouse, with empty patches scattered across the floor plan. People were leaving constantly. Some were cut during cost reductions. Others quit because they could not stand the new leadership. Each time I walked past the workstations, I saw another empty desk, another lonely swivel chair. The fifth floor, where I worked once, held more than 30 people. Now it barely had 10. Everyone said technology was making things leaner, but I knew that was an excuse. Frostline was weakening. The next morning, we had a full coordination team meeting. Lydia led it, and as always, she talked more than the agenda itself. When I stepped into the room, she was presenting a performance chart. The screen showed thermal risk forecasts, loss reduction metrics, and route optimization data. I recognized every algorithm. They were all direct results of ColdSense. But Lydia spoke as if she had written them herself. I sat down and listened as she explained concepts I had nurtured since they were nothing more than scribbles in my notebook. No one objected, partly because no one wanted to challenge Lydia, partly because they were too exhausted to care. Frostline had never rewarded truth. Silence was the only survival skill here. When the meeting ended, Lydia walked past me and placed a hand on my shoulder, as if we had just collaborated seamlessly. She whispered just loud enough for me to hear. You see, everything still runs smoothly. No one is irreplaceable. Her voice was light, but it carried the weight of stone. I did not respond. I only nodded, even as something unfamiliar stirred in me. They did not just underestimate me, they wanted me erased without leaving a trace. As I stepped out of the room, Jonah Reed called my name. Jonah was one of the few people at Frostline with a steady mind and an honest heart. He was about 8 years older, always carrying a large cup of coffee and a patient smile. Jonah knew I created ColdSense. In fact, he was the first person to understand what I was building 7 years ago, when I still ran simulations during lunch breaks. He pulled me aside near the records room. Arya, you need to be careful, he said. He showed me his phone, a screenshot of an internal notice. Frostline was reviewing all system access for mid-level employees. This was not normal, especially after you met with Victor yesterday. A chill ran down my spine, a cold completely different from the air conditioning. I asked if he knew why. Jonah shrugged. But he suspected the company was preparing to tighten control over anyone they believe might leave, or at least secure information before it was too late. His warning brought back memories of when I built ColdSense from scratch. Frostline did not care about predictive systems back then. I had an old laptop with a hinge that clicked every time I opened it. I wrote the first version of the algorithm with simulated data I generated myself. Each line of code labeled and logged carefully in the leather notebook I still keep. I never imagined it would become the backbone of Frostline. I built it for fun because the old system failed too often. No one asked me to do it. It was entirely personal work. When Frostline started using ColdSense, I emailed legal and operations, asking if they wanted to purchase ownership rights. I even suggested they offer reasonable compensation. That email was never answered. I once thought they were busy. Months later, I learned Lydia had quietly ignored the email. To avoid setting a precedent that employees could claim intellectual ownership, all of that returned like a freezing wave. Jonah watched me as if he could see every thought flashing through my mind. Arya, I think they will restrict your access soon. You should prepare. He was right. 2 days later, Frostline froze part of my system permissions. I discovered it one morning when I could not open the simulation tools I used every day. I contacted IT, but they replied vaguely that the company was restructuring and adjusting access levels. It was not an adjustment, it was isolation. I knew a company only did this when they believed someone could become a threat. I was not someone who sought conflict, but I was not naive. Frostline was preparing for the possibility that I might leave, and they would not let that happen easily. That evening, while I sat in my small apartment, my mother called through video. She lived in El Paso, nearly 10 hours away, but she always sensed when something was wrong. I had not said a word before she asked what was troubling me. I told her part of the truth, leaving out the pieces that would worry her. She listened and said something so gentle, it made me stop breathing for a moment. You have to learn to stand up for your worth. Not everyone will see it, but you cannot let them decide it for you. She was right. I knew she was right. But as I considered leaving Frostline, guilt crept in. There were good people here, people who had worked alongside me for years. I did not want to abandon them in a collapsing company, and I had no idea what leaving would bring or what risks it might pull them into. I lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling washed in shadows from the streetlights outside. For the first time in years, I did not know what I wanted tomorrow to look like or what was waiting ahead. I arrived at the office earlier than usual the next morning, not because I wanted to work, but because I had not slept after talking to my mother. Everything in my head felt like sheets of ice drifting apart. I stepped into the workspace and found 2 more empty desks. Frostline felt hollow from the inside out, and the weight of it pressed against my lungs. I turned on my computer, waited for the system to load, then an alert appeared. A new message. The subject line made me sit up straight. An email from Marco Truitt, the Chief Technology Officer of Polaris Freight. I had to read it twice to be sure my eyes were not playing tricks on me. Polaris was Frostline's biggest rival. Stronger, faster, more advanced, always leading the cold freight industry. I had never contacted them, never sent a resume, never hinted that I was thinking about leaving Frostline. Yet the email sat there in my inbox, calm and intentional, as if it had been waiting for me. Arya, I would like to invite you for coffee in Austin this weekend. I have something I want to discuss in person. No explanation, no recruitment pitch, just a single line carrying far more weight than the words on the screen. I sat still, staring at it. A message from Frostline's largest competitor arrived at the exact moment Frostline was tightening control over my system access. It was too aligned to be a coincidence. I replied briefly, only 2 sentences. I agreed to meet and suggested a cafe near Lady Bird Lake, bright and open, with wooden tables, sunlight everywhere. I wanted a place that did not feel secret, a place where I did not feel like I was doing something wrong. That weekend, I arrived 10 minutes early. Marco arrived shortly after. He looked exactly like the industry magazines had shown him, polished but not flashy, steady face, the presence of someone who knew his craft from the inside out. I recognized him instantly. Aria Moreno. Marco shook my hand. Thank you for taking the time. I know things at Frostline have not been easy. His words made me pause. I had only spoken to Jonah and my mother. How did Polaris know Frostline was in this much turmoil? We ordered coffee and sat by the window. Marco did not circle the topic. I have been watching ColdSense for years. That technology did not come from Frostline. He said it while looking directly at me. No one in their leadership understands how it works. I am certain of one thing. Only one person built it. My fingers tightened around the cup. Pride and fear collided inside me. I had never wanted ColdSense to be dissected until all its origins were exposed. Marco continued, You are the mind of this industry, Arya. Do you know that? I did not know how to answer. It had been years since anyone spoke about my work with real respect. At Frostline, people only said the system ran well, never why. Here, a man I had known only through reputation was telling me I was shaping the future of cold logistics. Marco placed a thin folder on the table. Inside was a formal offer. Vice President of Technology. A salary far beyond my current one. Company equity. Full protection of my intellectual property. A dedicated engineering team to build ColdSense 2.0 under my name. And unlike Frostline, everything is spelled out clearly in writing. I flipped through the pages, my hands trembling. For a moment, I could see an entirely new path stretching out in front of me, wide and bright, nothing like Frostline's freezing hallways. But 11 years of memories pulled me back. I thought about coworkers who had stood with me through outages and overnight fixes, simple lunches we shared, conversations that built quiet trust over the years. Walking away from all of them was not something I could do lightly. Marco seemed to read my hesitation. His voice lowered. I am not here to pressure you, but you deserve to work somewhere that sees you. You gave Frostline 11 years. What did they give you in return? I had no answer. The meeting ended, but his words followed me all the way home. I did not turn on the lights. I set my bag down and opened my laptop. I pulled up the old folder containing my first ColdSense simulations. I read through my earliest notes written in the unsure tone I had 7 years ago. I remembered nights when I worked until sunrise, running dozens of scenarios. No one knew. No one saw it. It was just me and the code. My phone lit up, a message from Jonah. Arya, they are reviewing your entire access history. I do not know why, but be careful. I stared at the message for a long time. Jonah's warnings, my meeting with Marco, Frostline freezing my access, and Victor's laugh. Everything connected into a map I could no longer ignore. I understood then that Frostline would never let me leave quietly, and if I did not protect myself now, they would twist the truth before I even made it to the door. That night, I made a decision, one that would change everything. I would leave Frostline before they could rewrite my story. I spent the entire evening wrestling with my decision. There was no delaying it anymore. The next morning, I printed my resignation, signed it, and walked straight to the 20th floor. A strange feeling rose in me as I stood outside Victor's office. The glass door that once made me tense now felt like the final barrier I needed to cross. Victor was reviewing financial reports when I placed the letter on his desk. He skimmed it fast, closed it, and spoke in a calm voice, so rehearsed it sounded false. Fine. Everyone is replaceable. If you want to leave, then leave. I only nodded. But as I stepped out, I knew that calm tone would not last. Victor never allowed anything he could not control. That afternoon, Jonah stopped by my desk, holding a folder to hide the way he whispered, "Arya, the IT team is combing through all your devices. They are reviewing access logs from the last 3 months." I froze. A cold line ran down my spine. Jonah said he overheard it in the engineering bay, and he feared Frostline was trying to pin something on me or lock me in before I walked out the door. Before I could react, Lydia appeared with an overly calm expression. She carried an old file and said Victor had asked her to review every email related to ColdSense. I looked at her, realizing she was the one who had buried my original ownership email years ago. The way she spoke, the way she watched me, made it clear Frostline was hunting for weak spots. The next morning, I received an urgent meeting request titled Final Reconciliation. I knew exactly what that meant. Inside the company, everyone called it the lock-in meeting. The room on the 17th floor was nearly empty except for Victor, Lydia, and a Frostline attorney. Victor invited me to sit, his voice sweet in a way that made my skin crawl. "We want to resolve this peacefully." The attorney slid a stack of papers toward me. I opened it. Frostline wanted to buy ColdSense for $5,000. Just $5,000 for the system that had kept this company afloat for 7 years. My chest tightened as I read the next clause. If I accepted the payment, I would have to agree not to work for any competitor for 2 years. I set the papers down. ColdSense was my personal project. My laptop, my hours, my work. If Frostline wanted ownership, they had 7 years to ask. I refused. Victor leaned forward slightly. "Arya, you are making this harder than it needs to be." His voice dropped, each word heavy with warning. Lydia stood beside him, silent, calculating. I kept my tone even. If the company wants to enter an intellectual property dispute, I am prepared to present all my documentation. The meeting ended. Lydia avoided my eyes. Victor spoke one last sentence before I reached the door. "Do not let this become the biggest mistake of your career." That afternoon, Jonah came to find me again. He slipped a brown envelope into my hand and told me to open it only after leaving the building. He spoke softly. "You will need proof that you offered to transfer ownership. Do not let them rewrite history." I thanked him and tucked it into my bag. I knew he was risking himself by helping me. Jonah had always believed truth mattered more than authority. My last day arrived faster than I expected. During the exit interview, the HR representative handed me another stack of papers, saying these were additional terms required to finalize my departure. When I read them carefully, I realized none of the clauses existed in my original contract. They tried to slip in vague language about intellectual property that could be used against me later. I placed the pen on the table. "I am not signing terms that are not part of the original agreement." She frowned, but could not force me. She collected the papers with irritation and ended the meeting with a quick checklist of formalities. I carried my belongings out of the building a little after 5 in the afternoon. The last light of the day washed the frostline windows in a soft gold that made the place look gentler than it deserved. I stood there for a moment, letting my breath settle. For years, most of my life had been tied to this company. Every step from the parking lot to my desk had carried loyalty and responsibility. But now, everything had shifted into a new chapter. I did not feel victorious. I did not feel triumphant. What spread through me was relief mixed with pain. Like cutting away something that had been attached to me so long, it almost felt like a part of my body. I turned and walked toward my car. I did not look back. When my hand touched the car door, I opened the envelope Jonah had given me. Inside was a printed copy of the original email I sent years ago asking whether Frostline wanted to purchase the ColdSense rights. It had a timestamp and the full content. The only thing Frostline had not done in 7 years was respond. I folded the email and slipped it into my chest of pocket. A small piece of evidence, but the first shield I would need for what came next. I knew I had left at the right time, and I knew Frostline was far from done. I arrived at Polaris headquarters on a mild, sunny morning in the middle of the week. The building sat near downtown Austin, not as tall as Frostline, but far more modern, open, and welcoming. People moved through the halls with purpose, but without the constant tension I had grown used to at Frostline. The moment I stepped into the reception area, the front desk attendant recognized my name and smiled. "We have been expecting you. Please follow me." Her words stopped me for a second. I had spent years being invisible, working behind the scenes, never the person anyone waited for. Hearing that my arrival mattered felt strange in the best way. Marco was waiting for me in the main atrium. He stood by the tall glass windows, holding 2 cups of coffee. He handed me one without asking what I liked. I was surprised. "You remembered this from our last meeting." Marco smiled. "The small details tell you who you should work with." We walked through the office before heading to the engineering wing. Polaris had its own simulation lab, bigger than Frostline's entire 5th floor. When I stepped inside, I saw nearly a dozen engineers running real-time thermodynamic models across bright screens. Marco introduced me to the team. Every person greeted me with enthusiasm and respect. They knew exactly who I was. No hedging, no downplaying. They knew cold sense came from me. And more importantly, they saw me as someone who would lead, not someone who belonged in the background. Marco took me to his office, then opened the door of the room next to it. "This will be your office, nothing extravagant, but quiet enough for you to work at your best." The room was bright, with a large window overlooking the city. I had never had a private office at Frostline. 11 years at a fading corner desk, surrounded by empty seats from every wave of layoffs. I set my bag down, sat in the new chair, and for the first time felt a sense of freedom in my work. During my first week, I began building ColdSense 2.0. The original version had been thrown together with self-made simulations and little time for refinement. At Polaris, I had a full team, real data streams, and a dedicated thermal testing facility. Every day felt like stepping into a new world, a place where creativity did not come with fear of being dismissed or erased. Within 6 weeks, ColdSense 2.0 launched internally with advanced thermal risk prediction capabilities. The system processed data 3 times faster, issued earlier warnings, and most importantly, reduced cold chain loss by 35% in real-world tests. When Marco saw the first report, he paused for a few seconds, then said only one sentence. "Arya, this is a leap for the entire industry." Polaris deployed ColdSense 2.0 on one of its major cold transport routes. Within 2 weeks, the impact was clear. Shipments once vulnerable to weather shifts and equipment failure, as were now corrected before damage occurred. Large clients began asking questions. By the 4th week, 3 companies that had been Frostline's cornerstones reached out to Polaris for information. The story spread quickly. Austin media, then logistics publications, picked it up. The headline I saw in a major trade magazine made me blink and reread it to be sure. "Polaris leads a breakthrough in cold chain technology. New algorithm ushers in a safer era for frozen transport." No one mentioned Frostline, no comparisons, just a simple truth. Polaris was doing what Frostline could not, and I knew why. Frostline had cut out its own brain. I thought about that as I scrolled through the article, wondering how Frostline was reacting. I did not have to wait long. Jonah was the first to message me. "Error rates are spiking out of control. You are not here to stabilize anything. The old system cannot update itself." In his message, Jonah said Victor had exploded in that morning's meeting. He blamed Lydia, claiming she mishandled the handover after I left. Lydia blamed IT. Both are avoiding responsibility. Frostline had always functioned by spreading blame thin so no one had to carry the full weight. But this time, what they lacked most was capability. Jonah added that after observing for a week, he believed the company was slipping into real danger. Morale was collapsing. People who once believed Frostline still had a direction were now looking elsewhere. Meanwhile, I was preparing for something significant. The National Cold Logistics Conference in Denver, where ColdSense 2.0 had been selected as a keynote presentation. Marco wanted me on stage to present the technology I had spent 7 years shaping. I remembered the moment I stepped onto the stage. Hundreds of industry leaders stared up at me. The lights shone on my face. No Victor, no Lydia, no one standing in front of my work to claim the credit. For the first time, I stood exactly where I should have been all along. I spoke about ColdSense 2.0, how its predictive architecture reshaped the way cold logistics operated. I spoke about reducing losses and strengthening quality control. And as I stood there, I realized Frostline had left itself behind. Not because I had walked away, but because they had never wanted to understand the value of what they had. When I stepped off stage, Marco was waiting with a proud look. But another message arrived from Jonah. Just 4 words. Victor has lost control. I understood instantly. It was not the warning of a fight. It was the warning of a collapse built from arrogance and neglect. Jonah's message about Victor losing control did not surprise me. I had known that moment would come, just not this quickly. What I did not expect was how reckless Victor was about to become. 3 days after the Denver conference, the moment I stepped into Polaris, Marco called me into a private meeting. His posture was more severe than usual. He placed his phone on the table and turned the screen toward me. They sent a threat to sue. Marco spoke plainly. The sender was Frostline Holdings, but the tone was unmistakably Victor's. They accused me of stealing intellectual property, of taking the ColdSense algorithm when I left. And that was not all. The attachment included a list of damage claims so exaggerated that it was almost laughable. I was not afraid, but anger rose in me as I read each line. ColdSense was my personal project. Every development record was written in my notebooks. Frostline never bought the rights, never compensated me fairly, never cared. Yet now they wanted to publicly rewrite the story and paint me as a thief. Marco continued, calm but cold, and that is only the beginning. He opened his laptop and pulled up a news article posted just hours earlier, a large headline. Internal source claims Polaris hired an engineer who stole proprietary algorithm. Beneath it was a photo of me at the conference, followed by dozens of comments from suspicious accounts accusing me of taking Frostline's technology. My throat went dry. This was far beyond a legal dispute. This was a coordinated media attack, a deliberate campaign. Marco looked at me. He had predicted Victor would resort to this. Frostline was losing clients. They needed a narrative to save face. The easiest way was to make me the reason for all their failures. But Victor was not done. 2 days later, Polaris operations reported multiple delayed shipments. Several suppliers who worked with both Frostline and Polaris suddenly altered their schedules without warning. Some orders were held for additional inspection with vague explanations. It was not hard to guess. Victor was pressuring partners behind the scenes, trying to disrupt Polaris by slowing the supply chain. Polaris responded immediately. Company lawyers began compiling my documentation. I submitted every ColdSense development log, Jonah's original email copy, my notes, and the simulation files from 7 years earlier. Everything was clear. I knew Frostline had no legal foundation, but that did not matter. They did not need truth, they only needed noise. The hearing took place nearly 3 weeks later at the Austin courthouse. That morning, I sat in a small conference room with Polaris's legal team, taking a few steady breaths to ground myself. I was not afraid of facing Victor or his attorneys. What I feared was how the story might affect the good people still at Frostline, the ones who had done nothing wrong. When I entered the courtroom, Victor was already seated at the opposite table with a lawyer and Lydia. Lydia avoided my gaze, tension visible across her face. I wondered if she was thinking about the email she hid or the times she took credit for my work. Frostline's attorney began by portraying me as a mid-level employee who abused her position to steal key technology. He spoke as if I were the sole cause of Frostline's collapse, as if everything would have been perfect had I never left. I listened, feeling as though I was watching a distorted version of my own life. When it was Polaris's turn, our lawyer presented every ColdSense development note written in my hand, along with simulation logs from my personal laptop. But the document that shook the room was Jonah's evidence. The original email from 7 years earlier, where I clearly asked whether Frostline wanted to purchase ownership. The timestamp, the content, and the fact that Lydia never forwarded it exposed a fatal crack in Frostline's argument. Lydia lowered her head as the email was projected on the screen. But the hardest blow came from another document, a short email written by Victor himself. Just implement it. We will sort out the acquisition later. The courtroom fell silent. No one spoke. Frostline's legal team had no explanation. That single line proved they knew ColdSense did not belong to them. They used it anyway, without agreement or compensation. The judge needed less than 2 minutes to make the final ruling. The lawsuit was dismissed. Frostline had no legal basis and could not pursue the matter further. The court also reprimanded Frostline for internal mismanagement and lack of transparency. When I stepped outside, reporters filled the courthouse steps. Many wanted Polaris's comments, but Marco told me I did not need to say a word. We got into the car and drove off silently. Marco placed his hand over mine as the car pulled away. You did exceptionally well. News of Frostline's failed lawsuit spread quickly through the business community. Articles began criticizing Victor for weaponizing litigation to hide leadership failures. Some commenters said Frostline should have valued a talented engineer instead of turning her into a scapegoat. I did not feel triumphant. As we drove, looking at the familiar buildings of Austin, all I felt was a heavy sadness. Frostline was losing clients one after another. They had shot themselves in the foot by pushing out the one person who could have held them together. I did not feel joy watching them fall. I only felt sorry for the people left behind. And for the first time in weeks, I understood something clearly. The path I was on was never about revenge. It was the only way to protect the worth I had fought so long to keep. After the hearing, I thought everything with Frostline had finally gone quiet. Polaris was entering the strongest growth phase it had ever seen. ColdSense 2.0 was outperforming every projection. Major clients were sending praise to the engineering team, and I was settling into the rhythm of a company that actually respected the people who built its future. But on that Tuesday morning, the calm shattered. Marco rushed into my office with a tense expression. Aria, we have a serious problem. He handed me an alert from the Dallas Operations Center. Cold storage number 4 was experiencing severe thermal instability. A pharmaceutical shipment worth $14 million was heating up at a rate that would terrify anyone. I looked at the system access logs and felt my chest tighten. A strange sequence of code appeared repeatedly between valid control commands. I enlarged the string. The protocol looked familiar, almost identical to the malware pattern Frostline's security team tested last year. Not a perfect match, but unmistakable in style. I did not voice my suspicion. There was no direct proof Frostline was involved. In this world, accusing without evidence only makes you a fool. Marco looked at me, knowing this was no routine failure. Within the hour, we were on a flight to Dallas. When we arrived, the engineering team was already gathered in the control room. The tension in the air felt heavy. The primary cooling system kept getting forced into mode shifts, causing dangerous temperature swings in the most sensitive sections. If it continued for even a few more minutes, the entire shipment would be ruined. I ordered ColdSense 2.0 into emergency mode and pulled all live data streams for analysis. The thermal map appeared like a chaotic image. Containers were heating in uneven clusters, something that only happened when someone tampered with the signal management layer rather than a mechanical fault. ColdSense began real-time simulations, running thousands of scenarios per second. Marco stood behind me. Aria, you lead. We follow. I instructed the engineers to divert cooling from the western wing to the central zone, where temperatures were rising the fastest. One engineer worried the west side might destabilize, but I trusted ColdSense. That area still had a reasonable safety margin. The numbers shifted instantly. 2 major containers stabilized, but the third continued to spike. ColdSense flagged it as high risk, estimating 8 minutes before irreversible damage. I studied the 3-dimensional model and saw the issue immediately. The attacker had not breached the core. They were manipulating sensor signaling, feeding false readings to the controllers. Unless we reclaimed control and rerouted correctly, that container was lost. I took a breath and ordered a manual override. A few engineers stiffened. Override ignored all built-in safeguards and handed direct control to the ColdSense logic I had written myself. It had never been tested outside the lab. Marco nodded. Follow Aria. When the override was activated, every coolant valve shifted direction under my command. The temperature line for the third container still swung wildly. We had about 5 minutes left. Then I remembered an old algorithm I prototyped 3 years earlier, a hotspot freeze, pushing a massive burst of coolant into a concentrated zone to smother the spike. It had been too risky on the old system, but with 2.0, I knew it could work. I entered the command sequence. ColdSense redirected all remaining cooling capacity into the third container. Warning lights flashed across the board. I stood still, eyes fixed on the numbers. The temperature dipped, slowly at first, then faster, then steady. The entire room held its breath. Then the indicators turned green. The $14 million shipment was saved. One engineer collapsed into a chair in relief. Another let out a shaky laugh. Marco placed a hand on my shoulder. Arya, you just saved Polaris from a devastating hit. I stood still for a moment. The victory was not in stopping the attack or proving ColdSense's strength. It came from knowing I was finally in the right place, a place that trusted me, gave me authority, and recognized what I brought to the table. As we left the cold storage facility, my phone vibrated, a message from Jonah. I do not know what is happening on your end, but Victor just lost his temper so badly that they had to stop the meeting. Looks like their interference plan failed. I stared at the message. This time, I felt no bitterness, no triumph, only clarity. Frostline was aiming for what they believed was my weak point, but they never understood that my real strength was never about striking back. It was about standing firm in the hardest moments with no one able to distort or overshadow that. I stepped outside. The Texas sky was a deep blue, the sunlight gentle, as if nothing had happened at all. But I knew this fight was far from over, and this time I was completely ready. The months after the Dallas incident passed like a chain of constant upheavals. Polaris grew so quickly that even we were surprised. ColdSense 2.0 became the new industry standard, and every week, another former Frostline client switched to Polaris. But our rise cast a harsh light on the collapse happening on the other side. Frostline lost 60% of its clients in only 3 months. Long-term partners began openly expressing concerns about outdated systems, internal cover-ups, and especially the lawsuit against a former employee. Suppliers wanted no part of the chaos. Some openly announced they were ending partnerships because of reputational risk. Jonah kept sending updates. In one message he wrote, "They are trying to patch the old system, but no one understands the architecture of ColdSense 1.0 deeply enough to maintain it. Every update creates new failures." I read those messages with a mix of sadness and distance. Even though I had left Frostline, I could not bring myself to celebrate their fall. A week later, I received the official announcement. Frostline's board had fired Victor. In his final internal meeting, he lost his temper so badly that he slammed his hand on the table and shouted that no one in the company knew sacrifice the way he did. But failure is failure. The board needed someone to blame. They chose Victor. Lydia tried to stay afloat. Jonah said she went from department to department, insisting she had nothing to do with the lawsuit, that she had simply followed orders. But the buried emails, the stolen credit, the blame shifting, all of it was already known. No one wanted to stand with her anymore. She was forced out 1 week after Victor. Frostline filed for Chapter 11, bankruptcy at the start of the next quarter. The news hit the front pages of several trade journals. But the numbers did not tell the real story. Hundreds of employees lost their jobs, many who had spent more than 15 years there. For them, Frostline was more than a workplace. It was a life. One morning, I received an email from a former Frostline employee. The subject line read, "What responsibility do you have?" I read it over and over. He wrote that his department had been dissolved completely. He said he did not blame me personally, but he could not shake the feeling that my departure had triggered the downfall. Another email arrived the same day. Then a LinkedIn message. Then more. All are carrying the same pain. They had lost their livelihoods and they needed someone to blame. I did not respond. I closed my laptop and sat unmoving in my office. Frostline had caused most of its own tragedy, but guilt still seeped into every thought. Even if I was not the cause, I was still a part of the chain that led to their collapse. That night, I could not sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, seeing faces I remembered clearly. The warehouse manager had worked there for 20 years. The accountant who always gave me a birthday. Pastry. The young engineer asked for help fixing his first error. They had done nothing wrong, yet they were the ones paying the price. Close to midnight, my phone lit up. A message from Jonah. He said, "I heard some people are blaming you. I want you to remember this. Do not blame yourself. You simply reclaimed what was already yours." Frostline fell because its foundation was broken long before you left. I sat up. His message felt like a small light inside a heavy night. I knew I had to do something, not to save Frostline, but to help the people caught in the fallout of Victor's mistakes. The next morning, I presented a proposal to Marco. The idea had kept me awake all night. The Cold Bridge Transition Program, a transition path designed specifically for former Frostline employees. I opened the slides and spoke more clearly than I expected. The program had 4 components: training for new technical skills, certification in Polaris standard cold chain operations, temporary financial assistance for the first 3 months, and priority hiring for open roles at Polaris and our partner companies. Marco stayed quiet for a long moment, then gave a soft smile. "Aria, this is not just an HR initiative. This is a statement. You want us to rebuild what Frostline lost." I nodded. I could not stand by and watch those people be left behind. The Polaris Executive Board approved Coldbridge after 2 meetings. When the program was announced, the press called Polaris the most human-centered company in the cold logistics sector. But what moved me most were the emails from people who had once blamed me. They apologized for their reaction. They told me they finally had hope again. Polaris hired more than 150 former Frostline employees in the first 4 months. Partner firms hired dozens more. People who thought their lives had ended with Frostline were finding new beginnings. Jonah was the last to message me. He wrote, "You did what Frostline never could. You saw the people behind the process." I read his message while standing by the window of my office, watching the city under the warm afternoon light. For the first time in months, I felt myself stepping out of Frostline's shadow. Not through victory, but through healing, for myself and for those who walked part of the road with me. Cold sense took me out of Frostline, but kindness kept me from becoming another victor. 1 year passed after Frostline's bankruptcy and the launch of the Cold Bridge program. My life changed in ways I never imagined. At Polaris, ColdSense 3.0 had just been released, the most powerful version yet, with 40% earlier risk prediction, real-time simulations twice as fast, and automatic route optimization during sudden thermal shifts. Watching the system run, I could hardly believe it started from a few lines of code I wrote in my small apartment 3 years earlier. The media called me the face of the new generation transforming cold chain logistics. But what made me proud was something entirely different: Aria Tech Lab. The academy I founded to support young women in STEM had grown faster than I expected. The first class had only 10 students. Now, every session receives hundreds of applications. Workshops on thermal modeling, data analysis, and especially intellectual property protection had become familiar destinations for engineering students across the country. My mother watched all of it through live streams, sending short messages filled with pride. When Aria Tech received an award from a nonprofit organization, she flew from El Paso to attend. When I walked on stage and saw her sitting in the front row with teary eyes and a smile that held years of hope, I knew everything I fought for had been worth it. One morning, while scrolling through my email, I stopped at a familiar name: Victor Hale. I opened the message, feeling time rewind. He apologized for underestimating me, for dismissing my proposals, for letting Frostline spiral into disaster. He wrote that he finally understood what real value meant. I read the email 3 times, then closed it. I did not reply. There was nothing left between us to say. Jonah had stepped into a new chapter of his own. After proving his integrity and capability, he was promoted to a senior management role at Polaris. When Marco asked if I knew someone who deserved an advancement, it took me only seconds to say Jonah's name. The small celebration he held made me laugh. He showed off his new office like a child with a first toy. But then he said something that left me quiet. "I am here because someone believed in me at the right moment." I told him he earned it. Jonah just smiled, as if he understood the things I chose not to say out loud. That summer, Polaris nominated me for the Innovation Leader of the Year award. I assumed I was just a symbolic nominee. But when the stage lights came down and my name was announced, I felt years of silence at Frostline finally fall away. I walked on stage, held the award, and saw the three most important people in my life sitting in the front row: my mother, Marco, and Jonah. I began my speech with my story, from a female engineer overlooked, undercredited, and called replaceable, to the moment I chose to walk away and save myself. I spoke about cold sense, about the legal fight, about the long nights haunted by the fallout. Frostline left behind. And then I said the most important thing: your worth is not defined by others. It begins the moment you rise after being dismissed. The room rose in applause. I saw my mother wipe her tears with a smile that told me she was finally seeing the strongest version of her daughter. After the ceremony ended, I stepped outside the Austin Convention Center. The night was dark, yet the city glowed with long ribbons of golden light stretching down the wide streets. A soft breeze eased the air. I stood on the steps, watching people move in the distance, feeling myself suspended between two worlds. The past finally closed, and the future unfolding like light spreading ahead of me. I thought about the more than 150 former Frostline employees who found new jobs through the Cold Bridge program, about the young women at Aria Tech Lab who wrote to tell me they landed their first internships, about how ColdSense 3.0 was being used across dozens of states to protect millions of dollars in goods every day. Then I thought about the version of myself who once sat quietly in the back of the conference room, speaking as softly as possible. The engineer who believed silence was the safest choice. The engineer who was laughed at for asking for a 15% raise. I smiled. She had not disappeared. She was standing right beside me, a reminder that every major victory begins with very small moments. A voice, a decision, a door closing. I walked down the steps and into the glow of Austin's lights. This time, I was not walking alone. I was walking for everyone who had been dismissed, unheard, told they were not important enough to change anything. And I knew I had opened a path for them to follow, stronger, braver, and seen for who they truly are. A new chapter had begun, and this time I was entirely free.